Somewhere in France, there's a cave wall that's been painted and repainted for 18,000 years by people who never met each other, and nobody actually knows why. Today, we're going into the dark to find out who was really down there, what they were actually doing on those walls, and why almost everything you learned about cave art in school is wrong. For over 100 years, the story was simple. Cavemen, grunting, drawing bison because they were hungry. Turns out, that story is almost entirely wrong. Homo sapiens might not have even painted the oldest cave art in Europe. In 3 caves in Spain, La Pasiega, Ardales, and Maltravieso scientists found red ladder shapes and hand stencils older than 64,800 years. At Maltravieso, some are over 66,700 years old. That's a problem modern humans didn't reach Western Europe until at least 20,000 years later. So who painted them? Neanderthals, the species we spent a century calling brutish, incapable of abstract thought-marking cave walls tens of thousands of years before we ever showed up. One researcher on the team put it bluntly, maybe the sharp line between them and us was never really there. But here's the catch: Neanderthal art never crosses one specific line. It's all abstract. Hand stencils, finger flutings dragged through soft rock, geometric shapes. Not one confirmed Neanderthal painting shows an animal. Figurative art actually depicting a living creature might be something only Homo sapiens ever figured out. And it gets stranger. We assumed the painters were men, rugged hunters marking their kills. Wrong again. Archaeologist Dean Snow measured the finger length ratios on hundreds of hand stencils across 8 caves in France and Spain. That ratio reliably differs between men and women enough to guess sex from a handprint alone. His result, roughly 3 out of every 4 stencils belonged to women. The entire man the hunter, man the painter assumption flipped with data, and women weren't down there alone. In France's Rouffignac cave, finger drag marks on the ceiling were matched to children as young as 2 to 5 years old. The most prolific young artist in that cave was a 5-year-old girl. Kid-sized footprints have turned up nearly 400 meters into total darkness in Italy's Basura cave. In France's Fontenette cave, children crawled through passages where the ceiling was barely 4 feet high. Toddlers in pitch-black passages hundreds of meters underground. Why bring a small child into that? Hold that question. It only gets stranger. Ask most people where the oldest cave art is, and they'll say France Lascaux, Chauvet, they're wrong by tens of thousands of years, and about 7,000 miles. The oldest known figurative art anywhere is in a cave called Liang Karampuang on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. Using a new laser dating technique, researchers pushed its age back to at least 51,200 years. And it's not just old, it's a scene. Human-like figures interacting with a wild pig in what researchers read as a hunting story, possibly a myth. If that reading holds, actual narrative art existed tens of thousands of years before anyone ever lifted a torch inside Lascaux. Nearby, in Lying Terongjeon, sits the oldest single animal portrait ever dated a warty pig, painted around 45,500 years ago, with individual facial warts and bristles rendered in careful detail. A portly swine, as one researcher called it. And it's still not confirmed as the oldest, just the oldest one anyone's managed to redate so far. Which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging: what else is out there that we simply haven't found yet? Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you: these painters weren't picking walls at random. They were choosing them by sound. In no cave, researchers mapped the paintings against where the cave's echo is strongest. The correlation was almost 90%. Some researchers have gone further, eyes closed, clapping and shouting, building entire echo maps by ear before ever looking at the walls. When they checked the art against their maps, most paintings sat within 1 meter of a resonance point. The human voice, some argue, was the GPS of the Ice Age, and it wasn't just sound. It was light. Painters overlapped legs, heads, and tails on the same animal. On purpose, a moving torch blurs the extra limbs into motion. It's animation, frame-by-frame storytelling, tens of thousands of years before frames were even a concept. Chauvet's lion panel has 10 separate lion heads painted onto it. Under steady light, it looks chaotic. But under flickering torchlight, researchers argue it may read as just 1 or 2 lions, caught mid-motion, a flipbook carved into stone. And Lascaux wasn't lit by accident either. Archaeologists have recovered over 100 stone lamps scattered through the cave. That's not a workspace. That's staging. That's theater. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about. Across roughly 400 cave sites in Europe, spanning 30,000 years, the same 32 abstract signs show up again and again. Random doodles. The same symbols, repeated for 30 millennia. And here's the detail that should stop you: cold geometric signs actually outnumber animal paintings in the overall record by at least 2 to 1. The abstract marks weren't decoration around the real art. By sheer volume, they may have been the point. Some of those exact signs turn up on cave walls on entirely different continents, which has left researchers wondering if they trace back to one shared point of origin somewhere in Africa long before humans split off toward Europe and Asia. Then there's the theory that reads like a thriller. A 2023 study proposed that certain dot and line sequences painted beside animals actually track a lunar calendar recording mating and birth seasons. If that holds up, it's a record-keeping system that predates every other known form of proto-writing by at least 10,000 years. And the person who cracked it wasn't a career archaeologist. It was a furniture conservator, working from library photographs on his own time. Sometimes the biggest discoveries don't come from where you'd expect. One more, at Gargas Cave, nearly half of over 200 hand stencils show fingers folded down or missing. The obvious explanation is mutilation, but not one positive handprint anywhere in Europe shows missing fingers, and the folded shapes include women's and children's hands too. Some linguists now think it wasn't injury at all. It might be an early form of sign language, a message folded into a hand, pressed onto a wall, meant to be read by someone who understood the code. We may be looking at some of the oldest deliberate communication on the planet, and we still can't fully translate it. For decades, the default explanation for all of this was simple: hunting magic. Paint the animal, and maybe the hunt goes well. It sounds reasonable. It's also almost certainly wrong. At Lascaux, archaeologists recovered the actual food waste. 90% of it was reindeer. So how many paintings of reindeer are in the whole cave? 1. Meanwhile, horses, a minor part of the diet, are the single most painted animal at Lascaux. That's the exact opposite of what paint what you want to catch would predict. It gets worse for the theory. Across Ice Age caves generally, some of the most frequently painted animals, lions, cave bears, hyenas, were dangerous predators. Nobody was hunting them for food. Nobody was eating them at all. So if it's not about diet, what is it about? One newer theory flips the whole question. Maybe painters weren't inventing these animals from a blank wall. Maybe they saw a crack, a bulge, a ripple in the stone already halfway to an animal shape and just added a few lines to finish what the rock had started. Ice Age pareidolia. The cave itself suggesting shapes in the dark and someone answering back with a torch and a piece of ochre. Here's something the quiet artist's studio image leaves out entirely: these caves were not empty. Cave bears used many of the same chambers as hibernation dens, sometimes at the very same time as the painters. Imagine painting a wall knowing the thing that carved those gouges might come back. In Chauvet's so-called skull chamber, researchers found a cave bear skull deliberately balanced on a flat rock, with evidence a fire had been lit there first. Nobody knows why ritual and simple curiosity are both still on the table, and reaching any of this art was never easy. Crawling, climbing, squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for a shoulder, by torchlight, sometimes over a mile underground. Every single time someone wanted to paint or just to look at cost them something. Real physical risk, undertaken on purpose, over and over for thousands of years. That's not decoration, that's devotion. Now notice what's missing. Tens of thousands of years of painting, and there's almost no landscapes, no plants, no sun, no moon, no stars. The entire visual vocabulary stays locked onto three things: animals, hands, and abstract signs, as if the choice of subject itself carried meaning we haven't fully decoded. And when humans do show up, they're rare and crude. Simple stick figure scratches. Compare that to the animals, rendered with extraordinary precision, muscle, motion, individual bristles on a warty pig 5,000 years old. That's almost backwards from what you'd expect if this were about self-portraiture, about saying I was here. The animals got the masterwork treatment. The humans got an afterthought. None of this was primitive smearing. Either the craft was genuinely technical. Hand stencils weren't handprints. They were made by blowing pigment through a hollow bone or reed around a hand pressed to the wall, an Ice Age airbrush technique, precise enough to capture fine detail. Even the pigments were engineered. Painters sometimes heated minerals to chemically shift yellow ochre into red. They mixed in extenders to stretch a limited paint supply across walls the size of a house, chemistry done from memory, underground by firelight. And here's the detail that gets me the most. Some of these panels weren't painted once and left alone. They were returned to and repainted across spans of over 18,000 years, longer than the entire span of recorded human history. The exact same wall, in the exact same dark chamber, stayed meaningful to hundreds of generations who never met each other, never spoke the same language, never knew each other's names. So why did they paint? Maybe it was ritual. Maybe it was memory, encoded in dots and folded fingers. Maybe it was a 5-year-old girl dragging her fingers through soft clay because it felt good, and a grown woman blowing red ochre around her own hand because she wanted to leave something behind. Nobody knows exactly, but something kept pulling people back into the dark, to the same spot on the same wall, for longer than we've had writing, longer than we've had cities, longer than almost anything we consider history. And maybe that's the most human detail in the entire story. If a wall could stay sacred for 18,000 years, it's worth a minute of yours. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, and tell me in the comments, what do you think they were actually trying to say?